The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week I'm pleased to have as my guest Tim McCarver, who caught in the majors for more than 2 decades with the Phillies, St. Louis Cardinals, Montreal Expos, and Boston Red Sox. A 2-time All-Star, McCarver was the starting catcher for the World Series champion Cardinals in 1964 and 1967, and the personal catcher for Hall of Famer Steve Carlton during their years together in Philadelphia. McCarver is also a Hall of Fame broadcaster, being the recipient of the 2012 Ford C. Frick Award. He is currently the host of the Tim McCarver Show, a weekly interview-style program that explores the careers of top sports personalities. The program runs from 8:30 to 9 o'clock a.m. on Pitch Blue and is distributed by the CBS Worldwide Network. Welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Thank you very much, Bill. Nice to be with you.
Tim, you were a prototype for Major League catchers in the 1960s. In fact, Wally Shank, who played the position for Connie Mack's A's, was quoted in the Sporting News as saying, "The kid reminds me of catcher Mickey Cochran. He's got Mickey's same aggressiveness and speed." That's pretty high praise considering that Cochran was a Hall of Famer and widely considered to be the best catcher in the history of the game before Johnny Bench, who played from 68 to 1983. Since your pro career covered parts of 4 decades, beginning in 1959 and ending in 1980, tell us, how did that position evolve during that time period in terms of game calling, style of catching, offense, and the physical attributes of those who played it?
Well, that covers a lot of territory. I was a catcher when I was 10 years old. So I signed as a catcher. I caught from an amateur standpoint until I was 17. Then I signed with the Cardinals in 1959. As far as, I was always a catcher. And then I never had a strong throwing arm, but I, caught some of the greatest pitchers in the history of the game, namely Steve Carlton and Bob Gibson. In the 1960s, there was nobody quite like Gibson. Steve Carlton learned his slider from him. Specifically, I was a catcher. And even though I played some left field, third base, first base, I was not good at those positions. I mean, I was born and bred to be a catcher. And that's what I prided myself on. And unfortunately, when you get older and you were a catcher, it takes its toll from a physical standpoint. But those are awfully nice comments being compared to a guy like Mickey Cochran. But the one thing that I wished from a physical standpoint, I wish my arm were stronger. I tried everything, isometrics, strengthening of every kind, and I just never had a strong arm.
And actually, it was from watching you, because I didn't have a strong arm as a catcher, was your quick release, because that's what made up for it. I mean, I would love to find out what your pop time was, because you were successful. You were successful. And the other thing that you did so well was pitch calling, which I think is something that is not emphasized nearly enough, I know, at the amateur level these days. And you did a magnificent job of that. I mean, there's a reason.
Well, you got to understand, Bill, that at the amateur level, you don't have the pitchers with which to work. At the amateur level, you're not calling pitches for Bob Gibson or Steve Carlton or Mike Torres or Bill Stoneman with Montreal, or Rick Wise, who was traded for Steve Carlton, or any of the number of other professional pitchers that you had to call games for. But it is an art. Not everybody puts the thought behind it, and realizing at the same time that everything centers around the pitcher. It's not, I laugh when I hear announcers talk about, someone never shakes him off as a pitcher because the catcher's been back there for a long time. Well, the good catchers encourage pitchers to shake him off, the young pitchers. I mean, after all, when they come up, a catcher may not know what the fort of a particular pitcher, so it's up to the pitcher to control the catcher, not the other way around. It's talked about a lot, and that the catcher is the guy who calls the game, and every young pitcher must abide by his pitch calling. That is not true. That's anything but true. The young pitcher, the catcher should follow the pitcher, not the other way around.
Now that's an interesting statement, because I remember some years ago in an interview we had, you mentioned that when a very young Steve Carlton was coming up with the Cardinals in 1965, I guess was his rookie year, and here you are, a veteran catcher, had a great 64 World Series, and you're shaving after a game after you caught him, and he comes up to you and he says, "You got to start calling much more breaking balls," and you took him to town on that comment.
Many more breaking balls. Well, that's the point. Steve, I was wrong at the time, because it was ingrained in me that I should be the one to demand a particular pitch. Only on rare occasions was that true, and Steve was right. And Steve, in many ways, taught me that was the situation, and that was the way that things. Even though Steve was young, I was young at the time. Even though I had more experience than Steve, because I'd played in the World Series and played several years more than Steve at the time. But Steve actually taught me things about the pitcher-catcher relationship. But it's a very, very important relationship. It's not understood perhaps the way it should be understood in baseball, and there are a lot of myths that are there between pitchers and catchers, and not really everybody understands it. It's a very very intense situation. The relationship between a pitcher and a catcher.
Yeah, and you handled it extremely well. I mean, during your tenure in St. Louis, you caught for 3 pennant winners, 2 world championship teams. You handled a tremendously talented pitching staff that not only included Carlton, but arguably the greatest right-hander in the game, Bob Gibson. These 2 guys extremely independently minded. Gibson was really a nasty pitcher, loved to throw inside. What was it like to catch these guys?
Well, as I said, I mean, Bob and Steve were Hall of Famers whom I caught, but there were many, many other guys who had great years with the Cardinals. Dick Hughes won 16 games in 1967, and when Bob Gibson went down with a broken ankle in 67, Nelson Browse came in and won 14 games with a microscopic earned run average. I was gifted in that I was able to catch quite an array of talented guys with the Cardinals. And when you think about it, the decade of the 1960s with Koufax and Gaylord Perry and Juan Marichal, Don Drysdale, it was a decade that was gifted that where baseball was gifted with the pitching talent that was available. I mean, it was a decade of the pitchers, and you could go back in baseball history and see that among all pitchers or among the decades in baseball, that pitching was richer in the 60s, arguably, than any other decade in the history of the game.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That also corresponded with the change of the raising of the mound, I believe.
It was the lowering of the mound after
the lowering of the mound.
1968 season, right?
Right.
That's
right.
when Bob Gibson had a 1.12 earned run average, and the next year they lowered the mound from 15 inches to 10 inches, which did not give pitchers the slope off of which to throw. They didn't have as high a starting point as they did prior to 1969. But they had to adapt, and I mean, to this day, Bob Gibson did not forgive baseball, or does not forgive baseball, because of that, because of the lowering of the mound after the 1968 season. And he's got some very good points. Here he is. He'll be 83 in November, and he's still mad at baseball from a competitive standpoint for lowering the mound that year. It was not an easy thing for guys to adapt to.
Mm-hmm. In 1969, it was our good fortune in Philadelphia that you were traded to the Phillies in a historic deal
exactly
that
after
sent you
the season.
After
the season.
Right, after the 69 season, that sent you and center fielder Curt Flood to Philadelphia for Dick Allen. Obviously, that trade became a precursor to all the player management issues in the 1970s, and one that changed the landscape of baseball forever, resulting eventually in free agency. But after playing with the Cardinals, Philadelphia must have been a letdown for you. How did you feel after that trade?
Well, it was neither a letdown or neither felt, made me feel good or bad, because that was the nature of the game. Even though I'd never been traded before, I'd signed with the Cardinals, as I said, in 1959, and then was traded after the 69 season. So I was with them for 11 years during a very successful period and a very successful decade. And Curt Flood was the first guy who fired the first salvo as far as free agency is concerned. He said he didn't think it was fair for him to be traded. Prior to that, the reserve clause, ad nauseum, you could go over that the way baseball was during those days. I mean, the minimum salary remained the same for 22 years, from 1945 to 1967, and it was unfair, and it's being proven to be unfair today. When you look back on prior to 1976, when free agency came in, the Peter Seitz decision, don't want to go over all that, but that changed the game, and it changed the game for the better from a player standpoint. Prior to that, before 1976, it was all owners, and a case can be made now that I don't think there's any surprise to anybody that today it's the players that are getting the better part of the deal. I don't think there's any question about that. But it should have been changed. I mean, after all, they're the show. They're the guys who make the machine run.
Mm-hmm. One of the other pieces of good fortune that we had in Philadelphia came in 1972 when Steve Carlton was reunited with you. You caught part of his first Cy Young Award winning season before you were traded to the Expos for catcher John Bateman. But then you returned to the Phillies as Carlton's catcher in 1975 and finished your career with the Phils in 1980 with your third and final World Series ring. I think it's no coincidence that Carlton won 3 of his 4 Cy Young Awards with you behind the plate. In fact, you once said that the two of you were so close that, quote, when Lefty and I die, we're going to be buried 60 feet 6 inches away from each other. Why did the two of you have such good chemistry?
Well, the biggest thing, a lot is made of that, of course, but the biggest thing, I went back to Philadelphia to audition for television stations, 2 of them, channels 3 and 6 in 1975. And I thought my career was over. I was only 34 years old, but I could still hit and I could still run. I couldn't throw, but I couldn't throw when I was successful back in the 60s. So Steve Carlton coincidentally was having a bad time. Over a period of 3 years, he was less than 500. That's after that 27-10 season in 1972. Remarkable for a bad ball club. I mean, he won 44% of the team's games. Unbelievable. But the one thing that he didn't do during those 3 years, he did not throw his slider enough. I mean, I had an opportunity to play on other teams. I was back with the Cardinals in 73 and 4, and guys would make an out against Lefty, and they'd come back to the bench and say, well, at least he didn't throw me the slider. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, he wasn't throwing the slider enough. And I was there when he started throwing the slider. He learned the grip of the slider from Bob Gibson on a trip to Japan in 1968, and he perfected it in 1972. And then, for whatever strange reason, he and Bob Boone, who was the regular catcher at the time, could not get together and didn't throw the slider enough. So I vowed that the chances were that I wouldn't have a chance to catch Steve Carlton. But lo and behold, fate intervened on opening day in 1976, and Johnny Oates, our third catcher, had his shoulder separated by Dave Parker of the Pirates, and we were down to 2 catchers. So I started catching Carlton. The Carlton thing began. We had to be successful immediately, and we were. I continued to hit. I could run, and for a catcher, after a long time, that was unusual, which meant that if I did get on base, I didn't have to be pinch run for in the later innings. So Steve was successful. He won his second Cy Young Award in 1977, I believe. Mm-hmm. And we were off. I mean, we had to be successful immediately. If Steve got off to a 1-3 start with me behind the plate, they would have scratched that thing in a minute. Paul Owens would have said, nope, we tried it, and we can't. I mean, you know, you can't experiment in the major leagues. You've got to know. And I knew that if I had a chance to catch Carlton, that he would do better than he had in the early 70s with the Phillies. And sure enough, he did. We were successful as a team, too. We won divisions in 76, 77, 78, and then the World Series in 1980. And the reason we won the World Series in 1980, it was a very good established ball club. But we needed one guy, and that one guy was Pete Rose. And if the trade hadn't been made or the free agency signing of Pete Rose, if that hadn't occurred, Phillies don't win in 1980. I think everybody knows that.
Oh, absolutely. But let me tell you, I remember that slider. That slider was a thing of beauty. As Willie Stargell said, trying to hit that slider was like trying to drink coffee with a fork. And every pitcher that I have that has a frame like Steve Carlton, I have tried to teach the slider to. And man, when that thing works, it handcuffs the hitter. It is, as Carl.
Well, it doesn't just work though, Bill. You have to be awfully strong. And
Yep.
and the one thing about Steve was way ahead of everybody as far as strength training. And he was the strongest guy I ever met, from the fingertips to the elbow of his left arm, and still is, as a matter of fact, and never really had arm problems as a result. And that's one reason the Dodgers, for instance, never taught the slider, was because it was too tough on the elbow. And Steve found a way of letting the ball go by just cutting through the ball. It was as much a cutter as it was a slider. So by cutting through it, he never had elbow problems. He never had to throw the pitch with the irritation on that elbow, on that left elbow, that most pitchers have, and eventually end up having Tommy John surgery as a result.
Yeah, it seemed like it was more of a throw and turn breaking ball where he pulled his elbow in so he wouldn't have to extend as much, and that really saved him.
No, it wasn't a throw and turn. It was a turn and throw.
Turn and throw. Yeah.
He cut through the ball, and because of his strength, he was strong enough to throw that slider with a very, very tight spin. And the tight spin allowed it to, most of the time, when right-handed batters in particular were swinging at that pitch, they swung at the illusion of a strike. It wasn't a strike. It was more often a ball. And that's, I mean, when you can coerce a hitter as a pitcher to swing at balls that are not strikes, then you know you got something. And that was the difference between Steve Carlton and anybody else who threw that pitch. It looked like a strike, but wasn't.
Now, Tim, there was a seamless transition from your playing career to the broadcast booth because the Phillies hired you to be part of the broadcast team after the 1980 season. Am I correct on that?
Right.
Okay.
That was my first year in the booth, and I couldn't have gone into a better broadcasting situation. I mean, I was the fifth broadcaster, and they only really needed four. But I was pushed by Bill Giles to take up on that on broadcasting, and by just watching guys like Harry Callis, Richie Ashburn, Chris Wheeler, these guys, Andy Musser was our fourth broadcaster, and they couldn't have treated me any better. And really, I was gaining the respect as a broadcaster I felt, to where when I finally got a chance to go to New York in 1983, I was prepared and ready to not only be an analyst, but to do play-by-play. I did play-by-play for 16 years with the New York Mets, and worked with the likes of Steve Zabriskie and Ralph Kiner, Gary Thorne, some really great partners through the years.
And then beginning in 1985, you started doing the World Series. And I got to tell you, I think I learned more baseball listening to you than in any other way. I was very happy when you were finally, your contributions as a broadcaster were recognized, with that induction into the Hall of Fame, because I certainly felt that you were underrated as a catcher. Anybody who was I felt you were very responsible for particularly Carlton's development, and then in St. Louis, those 2 World Series and 3 pennants, because you were an excellent defensive catcher and you were a good hitter. And I've always felt that, if the Hall of Fame had given more credit to catchers in those 2 categories, you were a solid lock. So I was really happy when your contributions as a broadcaster were recognized. But one thing I do want to ask you, some years after you started doing the World Series, you were quoted, I think it was sometime in the early 2000s, in a Boston Globe article saying that first World Series as a broadcaster in 1985, you were very nervous. And you said broadcasting a World Series was not even close to playing in one. As a player, you have a chance to do something about the outcome. From a player standpoint, you think you know about 85% of the game. Then you go upstairs and find out you're wrong about that. What did you mean by that?
I don't know that I said that. I didn't say that you go up there and you find out you were wrong about that.
Okay.
That was in response to Al Michaels before Game 2. He said, "Well, it begs the question: is it tougher to play in a World Series or broadcast one?" And I said, "No question about it. Broadcasting a World Series is much, much tougher than playing in it. I mean, when you're playing in it, you allow your ability to come through. When you're broadcasting it, I mean, a lot of the things you say are, before the fact. You have to know what you're talking about, the timing, very, very important. And I had some great teachers. Al Michaels was in the booth. I learned more about broadcasting probably from Al Michaels than any other partner I ever had. I worked with Keith Jackson. I worked with Dick Enberg. I worked with Jack Buck. I worked with Joe Buck for 18 years. So, I mean, with partners like that, I mean, how could you go wrong? But the answer to that question was in response to Al Michaels asking me whether it was tougher to broadcast a World Series or play in one. But I still hold to that. It's tougher to broadcast.
Yeah, I felt that you were, of all the baseball announcers I knew, I thought you were better prepared than any of them coming into World Series game. You always did your homework, and your analysis was spot on. I also felt that, baseball's a thinking person's game. And with some of the quotations, whether it come from Shakespeare, or any other.
Listen. Good announcers allow themselves to use their imagination while still sticking to the script of baseball. I mean, there's nothing that says that you have to stick strictly to the game. I mean, imaginations are wonderful things, and I think guys who are allowed to use their imagination in the booth, it makes the broadcast crisper, richer, and things of that nature. I remember working with Keith Jackson in the postseason, the only postseason we ever did, and Keith was recently passed about 4 months ago. And he told me before the playoffs began, it was the playoffs against the Mets and the Houston Astros, one of the great pairings of two teams. The Mets owned New York, and Houston arguably, not arguably, but they were the best second place. They were the second best team in baseball, I think. Some would say the Boston Red Sox. I thought the Astros were. But anyway, with that pitching of Nolan Ryan and Mike Scott and Bob Knepper, and they almost beat the Mets. But anyway, Keith Jackson told me before the playoffs began that he said, "I don't know a lot about baseball," which is quite an admittance from a guy like this. He said, "But I know a lot about television." So that made things very clear. You handle the baseball, I'll handle the television, and television end of it. And he was right. He was a delight to work with. But that one comment, I'll never forget that. He was really a good man. But I had so many great partners. Don Drysdale was another one. We worked the B games for ABC back in the early 80s. And, the Winder and I got along famously, and that's the one thing that I feel as though, for the most part, I got along with all of my partners very, very well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tim, thanks for being with us, and I think we were really fortunate to have you in Philadelphia for as many years as we did, and I think baseball was very fortunate to have you both as a player and the broadcast booth. So
thank you,
we
Bill.
Appreciate it.
I'll tell you, my days in Philadelphia, I can't say enough about. I'd come from a winning organization to a team that had been losing, with the exception of the 1964 season. It was an organization that was down, and when I came to the ball club in 1970, I ended up breaking my hand in early May of that year, and that was quite a blow to me, quite a blow to the Phillies, quite a blow to the ball club, I thought. But anyway, you could see the organization getting better and better and better, thanks to Dallas Green and Paul Owens and Ruley Carpenter. And I enjoyed my days in Philadelphia tremendously. I loved it, loved every minute of it.
Well, again, thank you. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal.